this is Marc Carroll. This is my Module 3 Power Tool Applications shop design video for MAC110 at Sonoran Desert Institute. Week 3, Assignment 3. Today's day is August the 9th, 2026. In this video, I'm going to walk you through three things. A recoil pad I fitted to a synthetic stock, 3 rotary tool projects on wood, plastic, and metal, and the design for an ultrasonic cleaning area in my own shop. Before I get into the work, a quick word on how this video is put together. Everything you're going to see was completed off camera. The pad installation, all 3 rotary tool projects, and the shop drawing. On camera, I'm showing you the finished work, explaining how I would get there, and connecting it back to what we covered in Module 3. The safety parts. There is no ammunition in the workspace. The weapon has been cleared. The magazine has been dropped. Bolt locked to the rear, and the chamber is clear. Here's the roadmap. Part 1 is the recoil pad installation on how a synthetic stock, covering the stock preparation, the jig setup, and the final fit. Part 2 is a rotary tool work with a finished project in wood, 1 in plastic and 1 in metal, plus a comparison of how those materials behaved. Part 3 of my ultrasonic cleaning area design with a drawing of my shop, the square footage, and the power, lighting, and ventilation the space needs. A note on method before I start. All of the hands-on work is already done, so nothing is being cut or ground while I'm recording. For each part, I'll show the results first, then explain the process and the reasoning behind it. I have staged all 3 projects and drawing in advance. The camera is on a tripod, and I would move it close where you need to see it fit and finish. Part 1, the synthetic stock recoil pad installation. This is how a synthetic stock with a recoil pad ground to fit. Let me start with what we had to have happen inside the stock before the pad ever went on. A synthetic stock is essentially a hollow shell with thin walls and internal ribs. If you drive pad screws straight into the shell, there is nothing solid for the threads to bite into, and the recoil will work those screws loose. The fix is a wood dowel bedded in epoxy behind the butt, so the screws have a real material to hold. I cleaned and scuffed the inside so the epoxy would key onto the shell, dry fit the dowel, and mark the depth. Then bedded it with a slow cure epoxy. My 2 challenges were keeping the dowel square while it set, which I solved with tape and resisting the urge to start drilling before it had fully cured. Here's the jig setup. All the grinding for the pad was done on the school provided belt and disc sander, which lives on top of my rolling tool bench. The jig clamps through the pad screws, holes, and rides against the center plating. So the pad, the plate, and the stock all share one axis. Tension matters here. It needs to be firm enough that nothing shifts under the belt. But if you crank it down, you distort the pad body, grind it at false profile, and the pad springs back oversized the moment you release it. Before the first pass, I check alignment of the toe at the heel and on both sides. And anytime I loosen the jig, I reseat the stock and check it again. This is where the jig really earns its keep. The lower adjustment sets the toe angle, which controls how the pad sweeps forward and toward the belly of the stock. Get it wrong and you see a lip or an overhang at the bottom edge. The upper adjustment sets the heel angle relative to the comb line, and setting the wrong leaves either a gap or a proud edge at the top. What the jig is doing is converting a hand and eye judgment into the repeatable mechanical setting, so the pad meets the belt at the same correct angle on every single pass. Those angles also determine length of pull and how the pad indexes into your shoulder. My grinding sequence went in 4 stages. All of it is on the school-provided belt and disc sander. I dropped the profile with the coarse belt, light pressured, working close but never past the jig plate. Then I switched to a finer belt to clean up the profile and pull out the coarse scratch marks. Throughout, I stopped often, releasing the pad and eyeball the fit against the stock. The last pass blended the pad edge flush with the stock contour. The technique points that matter. Keep the pad moving. Because dwelling in one spot burns and dishes the rubber. Use the light pressure so the belt cuts instead of dragging rolling the edge. I use the belt side for shaping the profile on this side against the table to square the pad base before it ever goes onto the stock. And let the pad cool rather than pushing through a long pass, because heat is the enemy on rubber. Here's a finished installation. I'm showing you off from the side, the top, the bottom, and the rear, and the coming along the seams, as you can see. Joint is flush. I also run a finger across the back. There's a gap you cannot see in the camera. You can absolutely feel. For quality control, I sighted this seam under raking lights, which exposes my high or low spots. Check the toe and heels edge for overhang on both sides and confirm the pad sits square to the comb with both screws drawing down evenly. If something were off, the diagnosis matters. A small overhang is a light corrective pass, but a gap at the heel or toe means the angle setting was wrong and not the amount of material I removed. To sum up part one, a flush, correctly lined pad with a consistent edge and no gaps. A clear reason why synthetic stocks need dowel and epoxy preparation. The understanding that the jig, not my eye, sets the toe and heel angles. Controlled grinding with light pressure and frequent fit checks and deliberate quality control at the end. All of that follows the recoil pad jig and grinding procedures from Module 3. Part 2, rotary tool work. I completed one project each in wood, plastic, and metal, and I will show you all three. Then compare how those materials actually behave under the tool. Before any bit touched anything, I plan each piece. I picked material will actually meet the bench. Decide on a specific shape or feature for each one. Mark the outline directly in the stock so you can judge the finished cut against the plan. I deliberately kept the shape simple. The point of the exercise, controlled technique, not a decorative showpiece. All three pieces were finished, deburred, and staged before I started recording. First, wood. I planned a rounded relief cut with a clean, even radius along a marked line because stock shaping inlet are everyday wood task in this trade. I used a sanding drum for the bulk shaping and a small burr for the tight radius at a moderate speed, since high speed just burnishes and glazes the surface. Wood cuts fast and forgives light pressure, but it disappears quickly if you're not paying attention, and the grain direction changes the bite. So cross grain will tear if you rush it. The result is a smooth radius that follows my line with a consistent depth and no burred marks. Second, plastic. I planned a shallow slot with square, clean walls to cut scribe line and pick plastic because the synthetic stock grips get exactly this treatment. I used fine cutting bit at reduced speed to control the heat, taking light repeated passes instead of one deep cut. Plastic was the least forgiving of the three. Heat melts and gums it almost instantly, and the chips load the bit, so you have to keep clearing the cut. What I am showing you is a crisp edge with no metal. What I'll be showing you was a crisp edge with no metal melted ridge and no re-welded swarf, and the wall stayed square because the pressure stayed light. Third, metal. I planned a chamfered edge and small radiuses corner cut to the layout line because the deburring and edge breaking are constant bench work. I used a carbide burr for stock removal and an abrasive stone to refine at higher speeds with a very light pressure. With safety glasses on the whole time, metal cut the slowest and demanded the steadiest hand. But the real risks were bit walk and vibration, not removing too much material. The finished piece has an even chamfer width along the full edge with no gouges and a uniform finish where the stone blended out the burn marks. Putting the three sides by side, wood took a standing drum or a small burr to moderate speed, cut fast and forgiving. And its main risks were burning and cross-grain tear out. Plastics took a fine cutter at a low speed with light passes, felt grabby and heat sensitive, and its risk was melting and loading the bit. Metal took a carbide burr and a stone at high speed and cut slowly but predictably, and its risks were bit walk and vibration. The thing that surprised me is that I expect metal to be the hardest material to work, but the plastic demanded the most restraint. Heat, not hardness, was the limiting factor on every pass. So when I would reach for the rotary tool instead of doing the job by hand. First example, Deburring edge work on something like a trigger guard, a magazine follower, or a single sight base. The rotary tool reaches inside contours of a file or a stone, simply cannot enter. It produces a uniform edge in a fraction of the time, and it gives me the same result across several parts in one job. Second example, reeving and leading, opening a stock channel or clearing an interface point for a barrel or bottom metal. It removes small, controlled amounts exactly where the fit is right, and it is faster and lower risk than chisel and rasp work. It is also the right tool for a damaged screw slot or fastener head. Now, the limitation, because this tool will get you in trouble. It removes material fast and permanently, so one careless second undoes careful work. Heat buildup is the first real constraint, especially on plastics and thin metal sections. It is a poor choice for flat, true surfaces where file or a stone controls flatness far better. Bit walking on hard, smooth material can scar a finished surface beyond an easy repair. And eye protection, dust and fume control, and secure work holding are not optional. When precision matters more than speed, hand tools are still the right answer. Part 3, the ultrasonic cleaner work area design. I built this around my own shop, so these are real dimensions and real equipment, not a generic diagram. The design starts with the workflow because the workflow decides the layout. A firearm comes in dirty, gets disassembled, goes in an ultrasonic tank, gets rinsed, gets dried, gets oiled and inspected, then gets reassembled and returned. My stations run left to right in that exact order, so a firearm never travels backward, and clean parts never cross the dirty bench. Separating intake from output prevents recontamination. The rinse sits between the tank and the dryer, so solution never reaches the oiling bench. And oiling is last and stays isolated from solvent vapor. For volume, parts stay in labeled baskets tagged to their work order. Batches move as a unit, and one basket dries while the next one runs. This is the drawing of my actual shop, 20 by 30, 600 square feet, air conditioned. I just put in a mini split this weekend. Number 1 in this corner is the ultrasonic cleaning area, 10 feet by 8 feet. Number 2 along the bottom wall is my main workbench, 4 feet by 6 feet, which is where assembly fitting happen, deliberately away from the wet work. Number 3 is the folding table, which I use for staging and drying and fold away when I need the floor. Number 4 and 5 are my 2 rolling tool benches, which are the real advantage of this layout because they move to wherever the work is instead of committing floor space. Number 6 is shelving on the wall for solution parts and PPE. Number 7 is the school-provided belt and disc sander. Rather than giving it dedicated floor space, mounted to the top of the rolling tool bench 1. That means the sander comes to the work, whether I'm grinding a recoil pad or a made bench or squaring up a part, and it rolls out of the aisle when I do not need it. Number 8, center of the floor is a mill working lathe, about 6 feet by 2.5 feet with this stand. I've placed it in the open center rather than against the wall so that I have clear access to both ends of the bed for long stock, and so chips fall in one contained area from the ultrasonic station away from the workbench where I do final assembly. It also sits within easy reach of the shelving on both rolling tool benches, so tooling and measuring gear comes to it. The open floor between the station gives me a 3-foot clear aisle everywhere I need one. What is missing there is the shop vac attachments that I also have in that area. Zooming into the cleaning area itself, 10 feet by 8 feet in the corner, the station run left to right, workflow order, making it intake, assembly, then the ultrasonic tank, then the rinse sink with the tank and sink adjacent, so wet parts travel inches, not feet. The tank sits on a solvent-rated bench directly under the exhaust fan and the exterior wall. The folding table serves as a drying and staging run. A rolling tool bench parks at the oiling station, rolls out when the job changes. Shelving at the far end holds solution, baskets, and PPE, clear of the work path, and the rinse sink drains to a collection container, not to the shop drain. Here are the numbers. The whole shop is 600 square feet, 20 by 30. The cleaning area takes 80 square feet of that, 10 by 8, which is about 13% of my floor. My main workbench is 24 square feet, 4 feet by 6. And I held a 3-foot clear aisle at every station. I got to those numbers by measuring my own shop first and laying out the footprint of the equipment I actually own. The 80 square feet covers a 10-foot bench run at 30 inches deep, which is the standard working depth, plus the sake and the drying oiling stations. Because the 2 tool benches roll, no square footage is permanently committed to them. Infrastructure, electrically, the ultrasonic tank and heater get a dedicated 120 volts, 20 amp circuit, because that combination draws hard and should not share with anything else. Everything in the area is GFC protected since water and solution are always present. And I want 4 to 6 outlets along the bench for the dryer. Lamps and compressor. For lighting, I want bright, even overhead lighting. The range of 75 to 100-foot candles, which dedicated task lighting at the inspection oiling station and high color rendering so I can actually see residue, pitting, and finished flaws. Position to avoid glare of wet parts. Ventilation is the critical one. An exhaust fan directly over the tank, vented outside because heated cleaning solutions release vapor continuously. I balance that exhaust with the makeup air so I'm not pulling conditioned air straight out of the building. Finally, safety and efficiency. Chemical labels and safety data sheets stay at the station. Spent solutions collected regular waste and never goes down the drain. PP is stored at the port of use, and every firearm is cleaned before any part enters the area. The efficiency comes from the one-direction flow, the short wet transfer between adjacent stations, and the tag baskets that let several firearms run in parallel. Power tools, rearward preparation and control. Materials behavior drives tool and bit choice more than the tool's own capability does. And shop layout is a tool in its own right. Thank you for watching MAC110, Week 3, Assignment 3, Module 3. Here is a list of my works cited. This works cited list, and I cite each of the verbally point before submit from each entry matches exact. I was using Brennell's website, Occupational OSHA's website, Robert Bosch Tool Corporation, Dremel Rotary Tools information, the lecture material for Section 3, Module 3, Week 3, Assignment 3, and that's about it. Thank you for listening.